Previously on agentpalmer.com, Yiddish Policeman's Union wrapped in surrealist Jewish musings. If I can do it for me, I can do it for you. And I can't wait for Kiel to publish his first book, whatever it happens to be. This is the Palmer Files, episode 56, featuring Skye Pillsbury, publicist, writer, journalist, marketer, technologist, and wearer of many other hats. We talk about technology, the cyclical nature of things, podcasting, the early internet, cultural Judaism, and much, much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 56th episode is Skye Pillsbury, whose career titles may be varied with the likes of publicist, journalist, marketer, and writer, but her career industry and her passion is technology, as you'll hear more about soon. The discussion is long and varied, so I'll keep this intro as short as possible. Technology is a common theme, but we talk about what is journalism and who is a journalist, the early internet and how people have or have not adjusted to technology as it evolves. We talk about podcasting because, as Skye was once the author of the Inside Podcasting newsletter and was once host of the Inside Podcasting podcast, she's one of my go-to sources for the medium. Plus, we also discuss so many more things, including choosing a favorite medium, anxiety, and cultural Judaism. Now, before we get going, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Skye at Skye Pillsbury, that's SKYEPILLSBURY, and this show at The Palmer Files. For all things Skye, following her on Twitter is the most efficient way to keep up with all of the articles she's writing for various publications, and it's a great way to stay in the know on the audio industry. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com, and remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. So without further ado, let's log on. Skye, I want to call you a technologist because you've been in and around technology for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Are you amazed at how cyclical things are? Like, you started you were writing for a newsletter. You started a podcast. Mm-hmm. Who knew? Like, if I had asked you 10 years ago, yeah, you have a newsletter. Newsletters are back. What? And podcasting is always going to be on-demand radio to me because I explain it to a lot of people that don't listen. And it's like, well, audio as a medium is back. Why are we back to these things? Like, it's supposed to be a video world, right?
Yeah. Well, you know what's funny is this reminds me of a conversation I had in Clubhouse. And we were just sort of like shooting the breeze. I think it was like Nick Qua and Ashley from The Verge and Evo, I think was the one who said it. Evo Terra said something like, we were all sort of like it was Nick's first time on Clubhouse. So we were sort of welcoming him there and trying to help him understand it. And Evo said something like, really it's funny because this is just like 1-900 numbers from the 90s, like where you would like meet up with strangers on a phone call. Like you'd call a number, not like a sex line, but like you call a number, you'd like, in quotes, like meet up with random stranger friends. And it was like to do when you were bored, lonely, looking for random fun, like whatever. And the only difference really with Clubhouse, I mean, there are differences in that you can see what's on your screen and you can, pull people up to a stage. And of course, like the technology has changed since then, but really it's like glamorized, old school group chat lines.
Yeah.
And it was, it was one of my first times on Clubhouse too. So I hadn't really had time to digest what is this thing that we're doing, but that really resonated with me. Like I don't think I ever called those numbers, but I definitely knew about them back in the day.
Yeah, see, back in the day, I'm going to date myself. Like, I was probably too young in that heyday, but I was also ahead of the curve technology-wise. So I was a technological snob that was like, oh, you're on AOL? IRC and ICQ are so much better. Like, I was that kid, right? Like, in high school, that was the thing. And there were a bunch of us that were on ICQ, and then we looked down on the AOL people. And then by the time I got to college in the early aughts, AOL was king. Everything else had basically disappeared. And, how is that not what Discord is now, right? Like, Discord is just all of your friends. They're either online, they're playing a game, or they're away. The only thing Discord needs to bring back like that ICQ AOL vibe is to be like, this is your away message.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny. I mean, I remember definitely thinking that anyone on AOL was kind of like a little bit lame. Like it felt like this like contrived world. I have actually never even seen the interface for AOL. The agency I worked with at the time, the people who ran that agency, I think, also thought it was lame. So it was sort of like trickle down culture. Like all of us were like, no, that's not how you get on the internet. And on the other hand, though, I do want to point out, because you did describe me as a technologist, and I do want to make it clear, for your listeners or just within this conversation, that I don't think of myself that way, even though I have worked in and around technology my entire career. My job has always been, whether I'm a publicist or whether, or in more recent years, on the writing side of it, and basically just jumped the fence. I've always thought that my job is to explain a technology, to find out how to explain it in regular terms so that like people can actually understand what it means. So I just don't want to pretend to be someone who is like, really, really well versed. And I mean, I think I have the kind of brain where I can go pretty deep, like with the founder of a company, a technology company, and grok it pretty quickly. But like, I've never written a line of code. I would just say.
Well, but I don't think you need, in order to be a technologist, I don't think you need to. I think you need to have that brain to understand it. I think, especially where we are now, there's the haves and the have-nots in terms of, I put this in your hand, whatever it is, and you can either figure out how it works or you don't. Like, right. I love my mother. She's not a technologist. My mother, I will always and forever need to explain it to her or show it to her, because that's who she is. And that's fine. But I've always been one of those, up until a certain point, I've always been able to get it. Yeah. And now I find myself going back to my high school and college attitudes of, this is how you use it, you're using it wrong, or like, you don't get it, and you being like just anybody else, right? Like I didn't know AOL either. I knew AOL from You've Got Mail, like the movie. That's how I knew the AOL interface. Otherwise, I don't know, whatever. Like when I was in college, my dorm room, we used those the poster tack to hang up free AOL hour CDs backwards, so you just saw the reflection, and covered a wall with it, because they were carpet bombing everything with it. And I honestly, I went from Prodigy in the mid 90s to the internet at large with Netscape, and completely skipped AOL. So I was a snob. I was like, what are you doing? What is this?
I had the same experience. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, to think back to those days, like, I remember when Mark Andreessen was on the cover of whatever it was, like Time magazine. And I mean, just thinking back to that whole world, I feel like that was like a different life that I led when, I saw the web before any of my friends. I had an email address before any of my friends. So I was that like my father had been involved in technology, and I had a somewhat of a fascination with it because of him, but no one else I knew was going into the field. And so and then it was just great timing. I mean, I think because I loved at least the first decade of it.
Yeah.
And it's weird how also when you said cyclical, I was sort of thinking about how in some ways my career path has been cyclical, and that I feel like I was able to be part of that world as it was exploding. I mean, that was the beginning of so many things, and really have a front row seat in my little corner of the world, at least. And then now, I mean, I'm definitely late to podcasts. I recognize that people have been podcasting for almost 20 years.
But I don't think you are. I honestly, I don't think you're late to podcasts in that it's still not established as a medium. And as much as, Marin's done 1,000 episodes, right? Hardwick, if you count his first and his last show, Kevin Smith, Rogan, if you count, there are thousands of shows these guys have done. And even on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, it's 10 years, it's 12 years, it's whatever. I still think podcast is in its infancy. It's not established. Like blogging, as an example, started, and it took like a decade for it to become ubiquitous, for people to understand what it was.
Yeah.
And but because it was text, because the internet was more primitive, it was easier to figure out what blogging was. Podcasting is so not that I feel like it'll be another 5 or 6 years before people figure out what to do with it. So I don't think you're late to the game. Like, because I'll gladly admit, like, my blog turns 10 this year, and I was late to blogging. But this show turned 2 this year, and I don't think I was late to podcast. I mean, I wasn't a pioneer, but I'm still going to consider myself one of the early adopters, because right now it's still it's still unknown.
That sort of reminds me of another thing, which is totally unrelated to podcasts, but I went to Burning Man 2 years in a row. I think it was 99 and 2000. And I remember, for some reason, this is just triggering that memory of like, I was going to Burning Man for the first time, and I thought we were already like, we are so late to the Burning Man game. And now I have people say to me all the time, I really want to go to Burning Man, but I just feel like I'm so late. And it's so ironic because when you're in the moment and you can't see the future, you have no perspective on like the beginning and the end. Like, you don't understand the history that you're part of until you're further away from it. Like maybe Burning Man will go on for the next 100 years. We don't know. And it's interesting. I mean, I just listened to 9/12 by Dan Taberski. Have you listened to it?
Not yet. I have a very weird relationship with that particular event because of where
Tell me.
Well, so I was in college. It was a very weird day, right? Like I can picture the day. I went to college in northeastern Pennsylvania, so like there were a lot of kids from the city, and it was just one of those. There are little elements of it that are just weird to me. My girlfriend at the time woke up for class. She never did, right? Like she went to her 8 a.m. class, which is why I was awake to watch the news, right? Like that never happened. Like any other time, and if that happens at any other day, like I'm still asleep. Somebody's gonna wake me up. Like you hear the stories of people like, "Wake up! This is going." So that, and then I was, we'll call me an overachiever. Is what?
Okay.
Academically, I was an underachiever, but outside of the classroom in clubs and organizations, super overachiever.
Okay.
So I was a journalist for the newspaper, the campus newspaper at the time. And so no one else in my journalism class or the classes around me cared about hard news at all. So I called the editor, which was our one teacher. We have a monthly newspaper. And I was like, I will write this.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And like, so it's just, and then I remember drinking in a hot tub later that night going, what the hell did we just live through? Right? Like, we didn't even know. Like, it's not even like been a day, and we're just like, I was underage. Like, the statute of limitations is up, but like everybody was drinking. Like, it was just what you did. How else are we going to cope? We're like 17, 18, 19. Like, so for me, every time it comes up, unless I find a way to be super busy, I am immediately transported back to that week.
Yeah.
And I'm not uncomfortable with being transported back there, but it feels like I've not moved on. Like, I didn't know anybody directly, right? It only impacted my life in the ways that, 9/11 affected the way this country divided itself and how our response was, but it wasn't, and in history and all this stuff. But for me, it's nice to remember. It's nice to, but I can't always continue to go back there. But what's interesting and kind of goes back to the technology is that was 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, there was no podcasting. And 20 years ago, maybe there was a newsletter or BBSs were still existing 20 years ago. I enjoy reading, and I enjoy reading about history. But mainly I read about technology and space. These are the two things I use, and biographies. But when you go and you read a history book on NASA and like the moon shots and the missions to the moon, it feels like a million years ago, right? Like, it feels like forever ago. And when you read about technology, in the same breath, it feels like a million years ago, because the internet was spawned around the technology for the internet was spawned around the same time we were trying to go to the moon. But the internet, as far as we know it today, is only about 40 years old as we know it today. So I'm reading history books from my lifetime.
Yeah.
9/11 happens 20 years ago, which is also during it's just so weird that we talk about cyclical, but in the grand scheme of like history, it's supposed to be hundreds of years or thousands of years, like not 20, not 5, not 10. When I entered my first professional job, newsletters were a thing you had to do, but they were becoming less and less because people weren't reading them. People weren't opening them. Now, had you either kept doing one or started one a few years ago, we're in the golden age again of this. It's like I go back to like the technologist because you've been around it. There's no rhyme or reason to any of this stuff. Like we really don't know which way the wind is going to blow.
Right. No, we don't.
And I call you a technologist because you can adapt to it. I can adapt to it. My mother, I have to hold her hand. You know what I mean? Like that. And what I find interesting is it's not people my mother's age. It just happens to be my father. I don't have to hold his hand. He's good. But I have friends that are my age or younger that just don't get it. Like, oh, what's that?
Right.
Well, how do you and then trying to explain it to somebody, because it's not my thing. Like I'm not on Snapchat, but I understand what it is. I'm not on TikTok, but I understand what it is. And because it's not my thing, how do I explain it to somebody who's just like, so I saw this on the news. I don't know how to help you. Like it's moving picture. It's another form of YouTube. What do you want from me? Like I'm out of because what I find amazing is, how am I going to explain this in 2 years when it's the next new thing or three times removed from that?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all about like not being able to see what's coming. We can't possibly see the future. And I absolutely see the point that you made about, it's hard to look back at that particular tragedy we were talking about earlier, and to revisit that feels maybe not productive, maybe a little bit heavy. So I'm going to quickly, just on that note, and I have no skin in this game at all, but for me, the reason why I was intrigued to listen to it is because it's not actually about 9/11.
Okay.
Like, it's not about, I don't want to relive the trauma that I definitely felt. I mean, you were talking about your day, and I had a also bizarre day. But like, the one thing that stands out is I do remember, like, I actually went to a rave that Friday night, and I had bought, this is when we all felt like united briefly as a country.
Yeah.
And I bought, totally out of character for me, like, bought an American flag hat. It was like, was weirdly,
was it one of the Dr. Seuss like
like
top hats?
No,
Oh, okay.
it was no. It was like a beanie.
Okay.
It was cool. It was like knitted.
Oh, okay.
And it had like stars and stripes on it. And I wore that to the rave. And I danced all freaking night. And with like people, we were in this like warehouse, and we were all just like, we have to dance. Like, we have to dance. We have to laugh. We have to celebrate the fact that we are still on this earth.
Yeah.
And we're going to figure this out. Of course, we had no idea all the other tragic stuff that was going to come. It was in that moment where we felt united. And I feel like what this podcast does is it takes very specific stories about what happened in the aftermath as 9/11 became more of an idea.
Yeah.
And not really an event. And it talks about sort of the ripple effects of that across, like, one incredible episode is the, like, comedians, like, how did they handle it? And they go through this whole, they basically profile the Onion. Do you remember the Onion?
Yeah.
Like, I remember when it came out and it was print,
I still have I don't know what it would be, a compilation magazine that's like maybe a half inch of like the best of the Onion.
I love the Onion. I still love it so much. And to hear them, I mean, they cry during the interviews. I mean, it's really heartfelt. So to me, it was like a really different take on like, I mean, on also just like who was Osama bin Laden, and like trying to see things, not to say that Osama was a great person by any stretch.
Yeah.
But that there is that conversation that we are all unwilling to have about what were his motivations and why. And that is like sacrilege, right? It takes a really unique, imaginative, complex approach to looking at what has life become and how has life changed in fundamental ways.
So to me, all of this goes back to Mark Andreessen, because Andreessen at one point said, if you lowered the intellectual educational cost of entry to the internet, it's going to become a dumpster fire. I'm paraphrasing. He said something much more actually like grandiose and like nice. But basically what he said was, if you let everybody on here, it's going to change. And I feel like, as one of those early adopters who was on when you needed a technical know-how to connect and to get onto a BBS or these are conversations we could have had. I think tough conversations are conversations we could have had. Now, if I ask the question, well, bin Laden was financed by us for a decade before all of that stuff, right? And that's an you can't say that. Like, it doesn't matter if it's truth. It doesn't matter if it's faulty, right? Like, it could be that. I mean, if you do your research, that will be bared out to be true. But even if it wasn't, like, oh, well, he loved pink socks. It doesn't matter. If you say anything, we now have you're wrong, you're right. And when the cost of entry to the internet was a technological know-how, we were all a little more forgiving. Like, oh, okay, well, you had to make sure that you were connected to the proper IP with the right port, so I'm going to give you a pass, and or at the very least, I'm going to hear you out. Now, because the internet is one click away, and everybody thinks it's a birthright.
Yes.
It's just like, well, now, I booted my phone. I booted up. So I'm now on the internet and you have to hear me out. Like, no, I don't. Like my favorite thing now is I'm a Twitter snob, I guess you would call me. I have there's 1,000 people following me, and that's great. And I like interacting with people.
Mm-hmm.
I follow 200 people or less, actually. And I see people complain like Twitter's a dumpster fire. Is it? Or are you just following too many people? Like, Twitter's not Facebook, and Facebook's not Twitter. And one of the things that gets kind of mixed up as we talk about like this knowledge barrier when we make things easier to access is that they all get homogenized. People think all social media is equal. It's not. They're not the same thing. Technically, YouTube's a social media. You can follow people, you can subscribe to them, you can do the same thing on Facebook and Twitter, and like, it's the tool. If you want to use a hammer to build a house, perfect. That's great. If I want to use a hammer to bash somebody's face in, that's on me. Like, that's my fault. Like,
yeah.
And as we talk about technology and people, like, what? Why? Like, why can't? Like, this is why we can't have nice things, because somebody's going to go out there and use this hammer as a weapon.
Yeah.
And that's what Twitter has become. That's what Facebook has become.
Yeah. And YouTube and all the platforms. I mean, and how really could we expect things to go a different way? But it's a perfect storm also of just having, polarizing issues, and then these platforms, and everyone thinks that they're a pundit, and yeah, it's a confusing time.
I want to ask you, because you were a journalist along the way in your journey.
Yeah.
And a couple episodes ago, I was told I was a journalist because of what I do, and I'm sharing stories, and on my blog I'm writing. Yeah, because of the podcast. Well, and because of the blog.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't feel like a journalist. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and what? Yeah, I mean, potentially everybody's a pundit, but I don't think everybody's a pundit, and I don't think everybody's a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like me being is that just me being unaccepting of a title, or like you were a real journalist? So like,
I mean, I still consider myself one.
Okay.
I think, I listen to a lot of podcasts where the people are really clear that they are not journalists. Like, for example, like Ear Hustle comes to mind. Like the hosts of Ear Hustle are always very clear. We are not journalists. We are creators, and we are listening to people, but we're not like, I mean, I'm sure they're doing some fact checking, but it's not like, it doesn't have that like journalistic, textbook idea of like, you won't print something or say something if it hasn't, been vetted and blah, blah, blah. Like, they are just, I've often thought about this actually, about being a potential story idea, which would be like, what is the difference between being a storyteller or, a podcast interviewer and like, quote unquote, true journalism? Because I think a lot of podcasts struggle with that. I think a lot of podcasters like you, but also otherwise, struggle with it. Like, I mean, I think the most egregious example is when the New York Times put out that Caliphate podcast, which, was about, a supposed, ISIS fighter. And it ended up, it was totally, they were duped. Like, the guy was not, they hadn't done their fact checking. And so I think that, in my mind at that time, it was really front and center for me. Like if you're going to make a podcast, like I don't think that we've clearly defined the difference in telling stories and hearing people's stories and then actually writing like a deeply reported fact-checked story, right? Like, and I think that there is some crossover. Like, I personally don't have a problem, but mainly dependent on the content that someone's putting out there, saying that someone is a journalist, as long as they, are following basic guidelines and, are sort of respecting sort of those rules of journalism. But so much of the rules of journalism have changed in podcasting because, your own personal experience and emotion is often part of the story. And that right there is a departure from what traditional journalism is, where you don't want to be part of the story. You're supposed to sort of take a back seat and say, and have no voice in it. But I think that's what also makes podcasts special. So it feels like there's a gray area there. But, if you're the New York Times, then I think you have to stick to the rules of strict journalism. They made a mistake by not doing that, in my mind.
But how much of it is on, I don't know what I call them, the audience, the user, because I don't want to have to get at the top. I don't want to have to create a drop at the top of my show that says, "Hi, I'm not a journalist." I don't.
No,
you
have to do that.
But I also feel like I'm a book reviewer, but I still don't consider myself a journalist. You know what I mean? I also don't have a thing on my blog that says I'm not a journalist. And how much of that is on the user to know this is just a guy who's talking to somebody else, or who read a book and wants to tell me about it. And that should be apparent. You know what I mean? My my podcast is my podcast, and I wear me on my sleeve at all times. And my blog is a caricature of myself, and it's not a professional website. It's a professional looking website, but there's a typewriter, there's a D20, there's an overhead glass of cup of coffee, and an overhead glass of scotch. You should know that I'm not the New York Times, right? You should know that when you come to my site. So how much of it is on the user who's well, this guy says that this book is amazing, and the Times said that this book was shit. So who am I gonna believe? Or were you just?
I think that with your book review blog or any other book review writing that you're doing, I think that is journalism, because journalism also, journalists write opinion pieces. It's not it depends on the content and the stated intention of the content. You're not, if you're doing a book review, you're not, that journalism is supposed to be your review. If you're writing about what happened in Afghanistan, you need to do your fact checking. That is a political issue. I think that there are journalists of all different shapes and sizes, and the amount of accountability that you have to say the words, "We're not journalists," depends on, your level of comfort with saying it or not saying it. But it also depends, I think, on what type of writing or journalism you're doing. I mean, you're definitely a writer, right? So
yeah.
I guess.
Look, I'm going to tell you this. You are blowing my college brain right now, because I loved writing editorials. Writing an editorial was the greatest thing in the history of writing. When I was whether it was feature writing or journalism 101 or 20, whatever, editorial, I love editorial. Listen to this podcast, the beginning, the end. Of course I love editorial. Who doesn't? This is my opinion. Bam, right? Mm-hmm. But I was always taught, maybe rightly or wrongly or indifferent, that the editorial was the ice cream, right? So that's the, you get to do editorial after 20 years of hard journalism. Because this is a college newspaper, you get to do an editorial. But in the real world, you're going to do obituaries, and then maybe you'll move on to sports or business or education, and then you're going to get into maybe a business beat, or you'll become a full, sports journalist, and then eventually we'll let you write a column, your own editorial column. This is yours. Yeah. I was always told that was it always seemed well, that's the dream. I'll get there in 20 years.
I do think, that there is a difference between hard journalism and, would people consider Oprah a journalist? Probably not.
That's a good question. I guess the other thing.
She does the same thing.
Yeah. I guess, and maybe it's because everything's moved so fast, and we are a product of when we grew up, that I think back when I think of now. So when I think of editorials, it is you earned your time. And those editorials aren't written by a new kid out of college. Those editorials are written by a 20-year veteran who's done hard news. Or the guy who's writing the Mets column covered the Mets for 20 years. So his opinion is not just like sports. You know what I mean? Like there's more to it. And so I don't know, like it's where the lines of entertainment and news blurred, which is like that's 17 other podcasts, right? Like they need clickbait because of how else are they going to get their...
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to describe yourself then maybe as a writer.
Okay.
And a podcaster. But I guess what I'm trying to not minimize is the idea that you're contributing to the world's body of exploration, and that in a both a writing and audio medium. And so I guess what I'm just trying to say is don't discount the idea that you have those instincts as a journalist. Maybe it is overstepping. Maybe it makes you uncomfortable to say, well, I'm a journalist. But I don't know. I think that the rules have changed a little bit with podcasting. And I think in some cases that's good, because I do think that a lot of what comes out of podcasts is kind of fascinating discussions that I would happily read in Vulture as part of a column, right?
Yeah.
But I also think that I think your point is fair that still today, if you're a true journalist, you probably are subscribing to the main principles behind true journalism. It's just that things have gotten a little bit blurry. And I think, again, with podcasts haven't helped like on that front. Like it makes it even more blurry. Like I did feel when I was hosting a podcast where I interviewed podcasters, I mean, I felt like I was coming to them with the same kind of prep work and the same kind of deep, thoughtful, specific questions that I would have asked them, even if that was for a print story for Hot Pod, which I feel like the work I did for Hot Pod, people would consider journalism. And so, I fact checked things. I called companies for comment, but I did feel like that same instinct to ask the deeper questions was there with me all along. When you have that instinct as a journalist and you want to get to those questions that open something up that's deeper than, that might be even a hard question. And so I think these days, this is why so many successful bloggers and newsletter writers are getting picked up by some of the big publications. Like some of them are leaving, some of them are going. Like Hunter Harris came from, I forget which publication. She has an incredible newsletter. Shout out to Hunter Harris. She's still doing the same kind of work. And then Delia Kai, I think, just got hired by maybe Vanity Fair. She was a newsletter writer and came out of that to be. So I guess I'm just saying, I think there's a lot of opportunities for cross-pollination. And hopefully what comes out of that is that the people who want to really have a journalistic ethic when they're on a podcast, those people will hopefully be noticed by the right audiences.
Yeah.
Because, that's what I love about listening to podcasts are people who've really done digging and really been thoughtful and, either in an interview like this, or in a print thing. It doesn't, like, to me, the distinctions are blurry. I think that can be a recipe for disaster or it can be a recipe for enlightenment.
See, and I've gone back and forth. I've tried. I don't know where I am with this particular show because there are times, like, I know who you are. And that's why I invited you on. And I'll do a little bit of cursory research just to be like, well, what do I want to talk about? Like, what do we want? What do you want to talk? Like, it's not completely like, oh, she's coming on and we're going to talk about what podcasting means to a segment of the, no, I mean, I want this to be a conversation, but because I want this to be a conversation, there are times when I've been super prepared and I've ruined a good episode because I need to be dumb. And I mean that in the nicest sense of the word. Like, I need to be able to be like, what is that? Instead of being super prepared and just assume, like, I need to be my audience.
Right.
Versus but I also need to be prepared. And I'm 50 plus episodes in and I still haven't found a good balance. Like, there are times when I'm like, especially because, I love editing this show because it gives me my Monday morning quarterback on myself. And it's like, well, you missed that, or why'd you keep going that way? Like, but I haven't found a balance for being prepared and my audience at the same time.
You're talking about a really complicated thing, I think, for a lot of us who host, or in my case, have hosted a podcast, which is you want there to be surprise.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what you're talking about in a sense, is that you want to give your listener, you want your surprise to be authentic.
Yeah.
And to not feel like, oh, well, I already knew that. And
where'd you go to college? Oh, I know the answer. What's your favorite color? Well, yeah, yeah.
Right. I mean, and I kind of feel like what you've been saying is like, this is kind of like an experimental thing for you right now. You're sort of like testing you're figuring out what appeals to you. And I do think that if you want to get more granular and focused on what your podcast is going to be, that maybe at some point that will become clear. Like, it will make it easier probably. But like right now, I think we're having a really interesting conversation. Maybe, I don't know what other people will think about it, but I am interested in this conversation. And I think the free flowing nature of it, I feel much more free. Like, I want to talk about your Star Wars t-shirt that you're wearing, or, the Wheaties box behind you. But and I feel like on this podcast, unlike a lot of other ones, I can do that.
Yeah.
But I will say that, my podcast was specific to talking about podcast creators, about a particular podcast and how it was made. And that just happened to be really clear to me that that's what I wanted to talk about. Like, I knew, like, even today, like, because I finished this podcast I told you about earlier today, and if I was still running that podcast, like, I would really want to talk to Dan Taberski about just how he did that, how he, I would have so many questions for him about the writing, about this, about that. And yet that was a very niche audience.
Yeah.
And yes, that's great. And maybe if I continued, like, I would have amassed like a much bigger audience, because my audience was decent, but like, my most popular episode was it was when I interviewed my boss, chasing a Calicanis. And I don't know how many downloads it has now because I don't own it anymore, but it had over 1,000 downloads, right? Like, that felt really great for a new podcast. But it wasn't like I was just like killing the downloads on every show.
I don't even look anymore.
Interviews I had personally that I think were my best were not like, huge hits, but like you're saying, it really meant something to me.
Yeah.
And I wanted to dig in, and I wanted, and with the question thing, I would often sort of like listen to a lot of interviews they've done already, and then try to avoid those specific questions, but like say, well, I've heard you talk about this. Here's my follow-up question to that, which I think for me at least made me feel like I'm getting to something new, which I think is a basic thing in journalism. Like, you don't want to repeat what's already out there. You want to create your own original thing that opens some eyes, is thought-provoking.
It's why I love Mark Maron so much, because we all know some of the guests on his show are doing it for promo of something.
Yeah.
And then they get thrown a curveball because they start talking about something else. And in the last 5 minutes, Mark's like, weren't you here for a movie? Like, do you want to pitch that? Like, and it's been an hour. It's been, it's long form conversation, and they've had a good one about stuff they don't normally talk about. And I enjoy that. Also, maybe it's the Northeaster in me, right? Like I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to college in Pennsylvania. Like, I hung out in New York, New Jersey. Like, it's diner life. This is what we do. We go sit and we talk in the diner over some coffee.
Right.
That's it. And these are always fun. Like, I've never had a bad time with a person in a diner.
Yeah.
Why can't I move that over? Now, I do want to ask you, I want to put you on the spot because you have done a lot. You've written, you've done podcasts, you've done a lot. I'm going to give you $1 million in venture to start creating content, but you have to choose one platform. You can choose text, you can choose video, you can choose audio.
It's not going to be video.
Okay.
That just doesn't, not that I'm averse to being on video, we're on video right now, and I think that that's helpful, but video is not my passion. There's something about the ears that, I feel like when I listen to a really great podcast, I feel like I am releasing oxytocin in my brain as I'm listening to it. There is for me, a real, I don't know, a physiological response. And I don't know exactly what it is, but I don't have the same response when I am watching a video of something. And I said this on my own podcast. I'm just going to say it here because I think it's relevant. I was talking about, I interviewed the producers behind the 1619 podcast. And then I had an after show where I was sort of talking about that experience. And I was saying that I have seen numerous documentaries about, racism in this country and its roots and all of that. And it's painful to watch. And we all have, I'm sure many of us have images of brutal racism, emblazoned onto our brains, but nothing impacted me the way that listening to a podcast about systemic racism and the legacy of slavery, nothing impacted me the way 1619, which was only in my ears, nothing had the same impact. So I would never, that really, I don't want to be cheesy and say, now I'm woke, but if I am at all woke, it's because of that. It's not because of the documentaries I watched, although, of course, those documentaries, of course, I had the, expected response to those, but somehow it really implanted itself in my brain. And so it wouldn't be video. Growing up, I always opted for when you could do the verbal report or the written report, I will do the oral report. I actually was really insecure about my writing ability during school. I was in honors English, but I was never in AP English. Okay. And then when I started in PR, I remember one of the first days that I was at my very first PR agency, a technology agency. And I remember writing a press release for the very first time and submitting it to the person who was my boss. And I remember it came back and it was covered in red pen. It was this is fucked up, and so is this, and so is that. And that was a little bit traumatic. Having thought of myself as a somewhat decent, not amazing, I'm never going to write a novel, but somewhat decent at writing in the language of English. And yet, it made me just feel more like I wanted to conquer that, not just the ability, but my fear of putting something out there that made me feel vulnerable. And so, I love writing. I'm really proud of the writing that I did for Hot Pod and will hopefully continue to do for other publications specific to podcasting. I feel like I have a lot more in me that I want to cover. But, what I used to say, one of the reasons why, frankly, I was happy to be done with my second season of the Inside Podcasting podcast Because when I left Inside.com, for whom I'd also written the newsletter of the same name, I didn't own the podcast. I didn't own the newsletter. And so I left that behind. But that had been like so much work. And just for me alone, like I did have producers, but I knew exactly what I wanted.
Yeah.
And, I basically told them what to do in terms of the editing, in terms of all of that. And then they would implement it. And sometimes they would, of course, come to me and say, I think you should change this to that or whatever. They were very helpful, not to minimize, their huge contributions. But that was it. It was the two of us. And it was a lot of work. And it was too much. Like I couldn't pay attention to my family. I barely slept. And so if I had a production team, like if I worked for a journalism organization and I was given the chance to just focus on podcasts and not write, at least right away, I would want to try that as long as I had support.
Okay.
Because I needed more people on my team and I didn't have them. Just sort of like bat around ideas and think about what the best cut is and what's the pull quote and what's the music. And there's as you know, like editing is kind of, it's not therapeutic. It can be soothing if you really get into a zone, but it's also painstaking. At least it was for me.
I feel on the fence about it. And like, I understand the importance and I love the importance of it. But when it comes to audio, I'm editing for two reasons. I'm editing for story, I'm editing for time. And so that pause right there, that might be shorter than what I originally took, because I'll take the time to listen to it and cut it so it's short enough, but not so short that it doesn't sound rushed. So it's still a natural pause and it's still a natural pregnant pause, but it's shorter, because if I cut out 10 of those, I save you 10 seconds in the runtime. And for me, I value your time and that's important. And if I get to keep that in, then maybe, whatever. So for me, like, it's kind of like a labor of love, because I am cutting those things down and then I'm listening and that doesn't sound natural. Okay, well, I guess I'm leaving it in, like just that kind of back and forth in my own head. For me, the podcast has always kind of been a solo effort, and I've never, solo except for the fact that, you're here. And even the solo episodes I run those scripts by someone else, because I'm like, before I spend the time to read this to no one, let's make sure it makes sense to someone. But for the blog has never been a solo effort. I have a group of people that get sent drafts because while I can edit myself, especially my number one editor, who happened to be a newspaper editor along his illustrious career, I've never had a perfect post. Never. Now, for clarification on a perfect post, I worked in tourism, and my editor is a longtime friend of mine, and he came down and I got him free tickets as long as he would write for our blog where I was working. And I got the draft and I sent it to my boss. Now, my boss, who loved me, and I loved my boss, hated my writing. Because again, never written a perfect post in my life. I handed her this thing, or I sent it to her or whatever. I think I handed it to her because she was one of those, like, I can edit it faster if I'm got the actual red pen out. And it was he had basically written a perfect post. Like, she didn't touch a word of it. And I was like, I will never have that brain.
Yeah. But
I am in awe of it, and I don't stop. Like, I guess the difference is, right? Like, you got that first one and wanted to prove better. I care, but like, I just want to share. I'm a very extroverted introvert. I want to share my story, but I don't want to do it. Like, I'll tell you and share that with the world. I'll write it down and share that with one person and then put it on the internet for the rest of the world to see. But I don't want to talk to 1,000 people. Like, 1,000 people can listen to this. 5 people can listen to this. I don't want to talk to 5 people. Are you crazy? No, but I'm with you. Video is out. Like I don't like I enjoy consuming it, but the complexity and personal nature of audio is as far as I want to go if I'm not going to be creating text.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this about me, but typically when I was interviewing someone, I didn't actually want to be able to see them. So when I would do interviews, well, I did a lot of the interviews I had access to like a beautiful, beautiful recording studio because my boss, Jason Calacanis, has a bunch of podcasts and he gave me, I could carte blanche, like I could use it where I wanted. And in that scenario, there's no one to look at. Like I'm in a studio, we're being piped in, most of the people I was interviewing were on the East Coast. So I would and at first I was really worried about that actually. The first person I ever interviewed was Madeline Barron, who is the creator of In the Dark. And I was so fucking nervous beyond belief. I wish I had recorded the audio of me walking into the studio.
Like like psyching yourself up or trying to calm yourself down?
No, it's more the heavy breathing. Just like I couldn't talk myself up. The first interview I'd ever done, and it was with a woman who I really admire. And I was just so nervous. I'd never done it, that kind of thing before. And she happened to be like, just by random chance, the first interview that I had scheduled. And I think, when you're doing that for the first time, you have such anxiety about like whether you're going to be able to pull it off, right? In the first place. And when I go back and listen to that episode now, I can hear it in my voice. I think I was able to edit it in a way that it flows and sounds natural, but I had to edit the shit out of that episode because my questions were too long. I was just out of my head. Sorry, were you going to ask a question?
Did that go away? Like you did 2 seasons of that. Did it go? It went away. For me, it doesn't. It doesn't. No, I still get nervous.
How nervous do you get? Were you nervous before interviewing me?
Yeah, I was nervous. Look, I did episodes 25, 26, 27, and 28, I think. I don't know. Somewhere in there, I did a 4-episode run on friendship. And it was my best friend from high school, my best friend from college, a best friend I met after college, and the best friend I've never met. I was nervous talking to those guys. I don't know.
Wait, best friend you never met.
Yeah.
You just need to clarify that.
Yeah. Well, we met on the internet.
Okay.
And then we started talking.
Met in person.
Yeah.
Got it.
And I'm nervous talking to them. I had Andrew Belling, who did the score for Ralph Bakshi's Wizards, on. I was super nervous before. Of course, like I've watched his movie. I owned the soundtrack. Like I have the CD like right over there. Yeah, of course. Of course I'm nervous. The last 5 guests, always. Look, and I understand that there are people who will argue maybe you shouldn't drink coffee every time you go podcast. But it's but that's what I do. Like certain athletes always drink yellow Gatorade. That's fine. Orange, red, whatever. Mine's coffee. But I think the day I'm not nervous is the day I hang it up. Like I honestly feel that way because I'm a very anxious person. I live with anxiety all the time. But
Jews do.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of it. My mother would wish I lived with a little more guilt, but hey. But like I've been watching or I just finished catching up on Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. They talk about the anxiety before going up on stage a lot, whether it's he's talking to an actor or a comedian. And I didn't equate it to that until I had watched that show. I just thought I was nervous because I only get one take at this. Like you and I'm Skye, I respect your time. Thank you for being here. This is all I get. Like what I make of this episode in the editing suite is what I make of this. But like, and this is why I feel like editing is important, but it's also, you get one shot. This is it. If I don't ask you something, I don't ask it. I can't manufacture that. Skye, by the way, I know we just had a wonderful, like, whatever minute conversation. Can you come back on? I realized I forgot to follow up on something in the 30th. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. So that's part of it.
I did it with someone because she was wearing headphones and the recording was all fucked up. She was wearing Bluetooth headphones and it just didn't, they were all these. I mean, she was fine. I ended up just saying, let's do it in 6 months. We'll have more to talk about. And she was actually fine with it. And if something turns out to be messed up with this, I would be willing to do it again. So not that you're talking about this conversation now, but I mean, I think, if whatever, something happens, you don't get the right one, I'm not sure that necessarily your chance is over. But your point is well taken that like you want, especially if you're interviewing someone like the guy who made that movie or whatever that you mentioned earlier, like, you don't want to ask. The person who I need to re-record with was someone I felt comfortable asking. I wouldn't have felt comfortable with that, certainly not with Madeline Barron. And so I do fully understand what you are talking about. My question is, do you ever, and maybe this would not be a solution for you, but what I was going towards earlier when we were talking is that I prefer to not see people when I'm talking to them for a couple of reasons. I think what I learned when I was interviewing in that studio was that I actually preferred to to only be focused on my ears and what my listeners were going to hear. But I think it also provided a little bit of a cushion so that I could ask questions that if I'm staring into someone's eyes, I may be a little afraid of the questions I'm going to ask. I'm afraid when I don't see them. And I'm just curious if you think that, not that you want to necessarily lose your nervousness, because I think some nervousness is
good, healthy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that that's not important, but I just wonder, like, have you ever tried?
So there's two answers, and they're both negative, right? Like the first is I like talking to you. And I feel like people are more, because this is more of a conversation than an interview, I feel people are a little more relaxed talking to a person. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if the connection gets bad, we can turn off video. If there's no video, which will usually lessen the bandwidth and make the audio better. If I don't have that, that's a buffer, right? Like I have done half of these shows where like, okay, hold on, your internet's getting bad. Let's just turn off video and keep going and see if it gets better. I don't have that as a buffer. And like, I feel like maybe that's a thing, but it's more the first one, but kind of a little bit the second one.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand that. I mean, I thought I was going to want to see people in person. And then for a variety, I did interview a couple people in person, but that was rare. And for me, I ended up, the other reason why I liked it, like, especially in the studio, it was kind of dimly lit, but yet like I could see my notes. And if I needed to like look at my notes for whatever reason, which you kind of hope you don't have to do that. But if I had to look at my notes, I didn't feel like, oh, my body language has to look like I have to be
okay.
Now, if I had a whole bunch of questions, I'd feel a little bit like, now you have to see me look in my notes for what I want to make. What was that question I wanted to make sure I asked?
Oh, okay. I mean,
so that was another thing.
I'm in the command center, right? Like I've got 3 screens, right? You're on the middle screen. Wow. The recording's on the right. And full disclosure, I have your bio on the left, but that was just making sure I knew like the boundaries, right? I'm not going to ask you about astrophysics, right? But the other thing is, This is pen and paper. Like, this is my baby. I don't make whatever, like little notes like, oh, we got on the call and we started at 12 minutes. Like, that's when the podcast started improper, right? Like or like, oh, I have a follow-up. Let's write that down. It's quieter than typing, right? Like for me, it's the pen and paper. Like everything else can go away as long as I know we're recording. Yeah. I don't know. And you know what? Here's the other thing. I don't lean into the Jewish bit a lot. It doesn't take a lot to guess, especially if you know someone who's especially culturally Jewish.
Right.
But I feel like I'm living into a stereotype. Like I'm a cultural Jew with a beard and a podcast. What?
Are you non-practicing?
I'm personal practicing. Like I went to we grew up conservative, then we moved and it was reform, and I went away to camp. I spent a semester abroad in Jerusalem, and so I have like the Reform Judaism chord book for prayers. So I can pick up my guitar and do myself like a little service on a Friday night if I want. And I have from time to time, but I haven't been a part of the community.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how long. So like, I feel like, look, at some point there's a list of professions that I want to have on this show. And rabbi is at the top of the list because when I was I don't know, what was I, 15, 16 when I was abroad? We would talk to rabbis and just argue with them. The best. I don't care who you are. I've heard that Jesuit priests are on this level, but like they will just argue with, like they bring it, like ask the questions.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why I'm living into the stereotype of the Jew with the podcast. We are taught from a very young age, culturally and within the religion, to ask questions.
Right. I know that. My daughter attends a Jewish school, which is why she's home today for Sukkot.
Yep.
Which, by the way, there are way too many high holidays. Can I just say that out loud?
That's fine. That's fine. Look,
ruined my work-life balance this September. Every week she has like 2 days off.
Yeah.
But I actually think like on a podcast, I mean, at least for me, like I really liked that you said it because, so I'm half Jewish, but both of my grandparents who were Jewish were basically atheists. So I didn't grow up with like really any religion in the house, but to your point, like I feel very culturally Jewish, just in the ways that I'm constantly questioning and asking questions. I think curiosity is like a super like underappreciated human trait. I like a good gregarious sense of humor. Like I feel very connected culturally to one of my grandparents, particularly who was all of those things. And I know it comes from like, I don't know, his DNA, his upbringing, whatever it comes from. He was, I don't know if he was born in Syria, but he was very young when he moved to this country, and Arabic was his first language because he was a Syrian Jew, and that's what they were speaking, at least in his family. But I feel like he has all those qualities that I totally associate with that. And I think on a podcast, people knowing who you really are is important, and lean into that part of your personality.
Well, I mean, look, when I have a rabbi on, I won't be able to hide it.
You have a rabbi in mind?
No, actually, not really, because I don't like the rabbi who I would have loved to have had on passed on, right? Because he was my bar mitzvah rabbi, and he died probably years ago, but we stayed in touch. He's the reason I got to go overseas. But yeah, I'm looking. I'm keeping an eye out.
Curious. I will say that, is he an actual rabbi? I can't guarantee that. I think he is, but he teaches Jewish studies at our school, and he's hilarious and super down to earth.
You know what? Most of them are.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Like I adore him. And when my daughter was doing Zoom school, especially not knowing really that much about like all the history and the significance and stuff like that, he just, he's got that great attitude of like, Jewish studies is just asking the big questions of life. And he's like, I mean, it probably wouldn't be appropriate, but I totally want to have beers with him. Like he is just like salt of the earth and in all the right ways. So anyway, if you can't find someone, I know someone who's just great and steeped in Jewish.
I can only imagine I won't have one on. You know, because my favorite Jewish joke is that, you know, there's an old Jew stranded on a desert island, and they come to, like, rescue him. The ship finally comes, Coast Guard comes off, and they're like, why are there two synagogues here? Go, oh, that's the one I go to, and that's the one I don't. Like, wasn't that fun? Seriously, though, I do take to heart all of the conversation you've just heard, because from a podcasting point of view, I have those discussions internally all the time about preparedness versus authentic surprise. But I want you to know that listening back, I noticed that we started a lot of little conversations in this episode, and we only finished a few. This is actually not the first episode it happened in, but it's the first time it happened enough that I want to tell you why I'm okay with this. I'm all right with it. It happens all the time in real life. Conversations move, and if you're willing to see where they go as a passenger with the other people, that can be beautiful. Also, because this is my show, I'm comfortable enough to know that I can invite a guest like Skye back on to continue the conversation, or more likely to have a new one and see where that goes. All of this is to say that if anything felt unfinished, reach out to us. As a listener of this show, that is your prerogative. We can't know that you want to know more. We can't know that you want to follow up. We can't know that you have a rebuttal, an example, or even a compliment. And if you're not on Twitter, I give out my email every show. And if applicable, I will share it with the guest. Use me as a conduit if you wish, but let me say this. If you have reached out, thank you. I enjoy the interaction. But if you haven't, would you reach out enough to tell me why you haven't? Not every conversation needs to be left unfinished. Think about it. Thanks for listening to The Palmer Files, episode 56. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer, my guest Skye at Skye Pillsbury, that's SKYEPILLSBURY, and this show at The Palmer Files. For all things Skye, following her on Twitter is the most efficient way to keep up with the articles she's writing for various publications, and it's a good way to stay in the know on the audio industry. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. Okay, Skye, do you have one final question for me?
Yes. I'm very curious. As I mentioned earlier, you are wearing a Star Wars t-shirt.
Yes.
It has, I believe that is Chinese writing.
Yep.
And having grown up obsessed with the Star Wars franchise, I was Princess Leia for Halloween, perhaps more than once. I had the Star Wars sheets. I saw the movie 11 times in the theater. I just want to know, like, what does it mean to you, and why is there Chinese writing on it, and like anything you would like to share about it.
So the shirt in particular, I spent 7 years in what I like to call retail hell, which was I got out of college and couldn't find a real job, so I ended up in retail. Not to say that that's not, but I went to college to get a white collar job. Like, that's why I went to college and learned to write and all those things. And I ended up in retail for 7 years. And, that was literally 15 years ago. And what would happen is things would go on sale. And as a Star Wars fan or a Marvel fan, when shirts like this became available for $2, I bought like 4. I have 3 of these exact same shirt because it's like, well, when one goes bad, throw it away. I think I still have 2 left. This is one of 2 left. So I have tons of these still.
Okay.
In fact,
store I have to ask.
Kohl's.
Yeah. Okay, got it.
But being a fan was just, it was my core group. We were Lord of the Rings fans. We were Star Wars fans.
I am too. I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
And it's one of those things where, like, in 6th grade, we started reading and talking about, we played D&D. I was a very, I don't know which, the invisible visible kid. Like, I ran cross country, so I kind of got around with the jocks, but I was in band and I played with the geeks, obviously. And I was in a cover band playing bass. Like, I was everywhere, but Star Wars was just part of the lexicon of being a geek at that time, along with D&D and Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
But really, one of the cultural touchstones, and argue about it if you want, and I still have to go back and rewatch it. I remember the event of Phantom Menace, right? Like, I was still in high school, and we got out of school, and we drove to the movie theater, and we got in line for the Thursday midnight showing. And we were there for 8 hours, right? Like, you get out of school, like, what, 2:45, 3 o'clock at that point? Like, and we were there in line. I was with a group of like 10 kids from my high school. Some of us were friends, others weren't, but we became friends hanging out for 8 hours outside of a movie theater. And it was just this event. And,
yeah, it was a cultural event.
And it was, I don't know what it was before that, right? Because before that, it was just renting it, because my generation didn't have, we had the re-releases, but we didn't have a thing. Like, we grew up knowing that it was important, right? But, and I don't know, to me, Kenobi's my guy. Like, that's my touchstone to the franchise. It's not Luke, it's not Vader, it will always and forever be Kenobi, but I don't know, there's just something about it and the grandioseness of it. And I don't know, you just fall in love with it. I feel like it's one of those things. I feel like that's, when I talk to people who grew up with Trek or who grew up with Twilight Zone, it's the same thing. They talk about it with reverence and love, but it just happened. They didn't have a choice. This is, I'm a fan. And then it kind of goes away, right? Like, you grow up, you get out of it. And then, I don't know, like, probably around the same time I was in retail hell, like, the movies, the original trilogy started being like put on heavy rotation in syndication. And you'd see it on TNT or Spike or whatever Spike's called now, right? Or USA, like, you'd see it. And now even like, and it's just continued to this day. Like, you can turn on the TV if you have cable or of any kind, and you could find Star Wars. And I think what happened was, I was at a point in my life where things weren't going very well. And I took comfort in the fact that at any time I could turn on these movies that comfort me.
Yeah.
And you fall back in love with it as a 20-something.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh my God, why did I stop watching these? Like, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
And now it's just like, it's just part of it. And hopefully this will make sense in the edit, but like, the Wheaties boxes are other things, right? Like, so there's three boxes. There's 3 cereals behind me. 2 are Cal Ripken. Because from my father, who grew up in Baltimore, even though I don't live there, I became an Orioles fan, and that was it. It was Cal Ripken. Yeah. So it's a Cal Ripken Wheaties. It's a Cal Ripken. I have to turn around. It's a Cal Ripken Classic Cal's. It was one of those fake cereal, like promo cereals they did. And the other box is Flutie Flakes from Doug Flutie, who, went to Boston College as a quarterback and shocked Miami and then did lots of other things in the NFL and CFL. But it
You were a little nerdy, but you were into sports too.
100%.
You were a generalist.
Still to this day, like Saturdays, college football, Sundays, NFL. And then, I've been watching baseball all year, and then I'll watch the NBA playoffs, and I'll watch a little NASCAR and Formula One, and then I'll go read, I got into Terry Brooks. Wait, what?
What books are you reading?
Anything. No, a lot, actually. I've been reading through all of Len Dayton. I've been reading through a lot of Douglas Copeland, but I'm also reading, like, biographies and histories, and I'm gonna... The thing,
Renaissance man.
Okay, so this hurts and it helps, right? So I've talked about this on the show before. I've been out of work for almost 2 years. By the time this comes out, it'll be close to 2 years. And as I've been networking, I've been hearing two conflicting things. One, you can do a lot of things. You're a jack of all trades. That's really good. Thank you. Two, you need to focus. You have to be great at one thing. I can talk to 10 people and get 5 people on either side. So I'm never going to be an expert in anything because the rest of my life is generalism. I enjoy all the sports. I
disagree with you there. If you wanted to be an expert in something and become known for being an expert in something, you could do it. That may just not be what you want.
That's fair. Okay. I take it back. I enjoy all of the things and I don't want to focus on one. So yeah, that's fine. Yeah. I may need you from personal publicist so I can get a job now.
Yes. I mean, I do think that there's ways to still be a generalist and find ways to still hear the different stories from your guests on this show, but maybe put it around a structure of like, we're going to talk about 3 or 5 specific questions that maybe have nothing to do with what you do. But I understand that then that would take away from this idea of you follow the conversation wherever it leads.
So this will be up there. This will be now example 2 of the most drastic left turns, right? But the most drastic left turn still belongs to episode 5, which I had her on to talk about wellness and fitness, and we took a left turn and just talked about, like, we both worked in fast food and, like, we'd stay out all night and do all this unhealthy stuff when we were... I love that. Like, yeah. That's great. That makes for better podcasting than just talking about wellness and fitness, which, I mean, was fun, but, It
is really magical when that can happen in a good way. If you have a guest who can bring you something that's actually interesting.
Yeah.
I think my fear personally, if I was hosting your podcast, is telling the guest that we can go anywhere and then having a guest who just totally sucks.
That's on me, though. That's when I have to go into overdrive. In fact, I challenge anyone who's listened to all of these episodes, you can find the ones where I had to pick up a little bit more. And it's not me being more talkative, because some conversations I have stories to tell, right? Like, that's just how it happens. But there are some episodes where it's like, all right, well, I carried a lot more of that than I wanted to.
Right. No, you can definitely tell when it's harder. And I mean, we're all still perfecting the craft of being good interviewers. And that's another thing, actually, we're wrapping up, I know, but that's another thing that, quite frankly, I love about writing is that my interviews are usually, I know exactly what I'm going for. And also the content, like my interviews can be more, directed. Like I'm talking to someone about a particular event that they experienced or something like that. But also I know that if they're droning on and not giving me what I need, But like that there's some stuff in there that might be useful. I'm like, okay, I can write one sentence in my story and summarize the last 2 minutes of what this person said. And then I can use the decent quote that they said after that. You know, I don't have to like figure out a way to make the droning on sound great because I just summarize it in my articles. So, you know, I'm of two minds about it. If I had a production team who could do the editing and who like we had a mind meld and they knew what I wanted, then I'd be totally open to that. But I do really love the freedom of writing as well. They're both free in different ways.